Alright, let's look at another game by the great attacking player Alexander Alekhine. Here, Alekhine had the black pieces against the very famous chess author Aaron Nimzovitsch. Nimzovitsch played d4. Alekhine played d5, knight f3, and c5. Bishop f4. This is similar to what Boris Rook recently recommends against the London, this kind of Queen's Gambit with colors reversed. Knight c6, e3, knight f6. Here, it's important to notice that Queen b6, a move that black does want to play, isn't quite as effective as it normally would be because knight c3 is a powerful move. Just kind of working together with the bishop on f4. For instance, if knight f6 now, then simply knight b5, and this is a difficult point to defend. And if queen takes pawn, the same thing. The queen defends the rook. We just play knight b5, hitting c7. Okay, but that's not what was played. Instead of queen b6, Alekhine played knight f6, and now knight c3 anyway, setting up this threat on b5 with the bishop and knight coordinating on the c7 square. For instance, if black were to play queen b6 now, then knight b5 could still be a problem. Obviously, there's a fork here. The best move for black would be e5, but even here, white could simply take the pawn with their bishop, and after knight takes e5, pawn takes e5, let's say the black knight runs away to e4. Now the pawn on d5 would fall, and here black would have difficulty getting back into the game. Okay. Another possibility here after, instead of queen b6, would be e6 right away. The same idea, the bishop pointed at c7. If now, knight b5, this becomes a real problem. e5 would fail for all the reasons we just looked at. Pawn push, takes here, and if knight e4, there's actually a little trick here. White can still just play queen takes d5, because if queen captures d5, white can recuperate the queen with knight c7 check, forking the king and queen, and just winning a pawn and having a good game. Okay, only highlighting some of these ideas behind this odd knight c3 move. Usually white would play c3 here, pawn c3, and then bishop d3. So this knight c3, it has some tactical ideas. One last interesting one that's worth looking at is, let's say queen b6 is played and a6, and let's say black decides just to lose the exchange. Well, here white's actually not going to capture the exchange, but can trap the queen with bishop c7, attacking the queen, taking all these squares away. So a lot of venom behind this knight c3 move. But Alekhine plays bishop g4, and this solves all of those problems. So by vacating the c8 square, it prepares rook c8, which would defend c7 an additional time. So if knight b5 is played, there's no more threats on c7. Okay, bishop b5, pinning the knight. e6 now. h3 hitting the bishop on g4. The bishop retreats. g4, gaining lots of space on the king side, although you might also say weakening the king side. Knight e5, and now queen b6. Here white plays a very interesting move. Nimzovitsch plays a4, and the idea is quite deep. So black would love to just play pawn takes pawn, and then finish their development with bishop b4. In his notes to the game, Alexander Alekhine really liked this move a4, Instead, it forces black to play a5. For instance, a5 is what he played in the game, but if he continues with his plan and just plays, let's say, c takes d4, and then the idea is to continue with bishop b4, white does not have to capture back and instead can play a5, attacking the queen. When the queen retreats, we don't want to go to c7 because there's a bishop on f4 that would be pointed at us. Let's say queen d8. Now a6, undermining the support of the knight on c6. And so still the knight on c3 is hanging, but if we were to take it, pawn takes knight, now pawn takes b7 is a big problem. The rook on a8 is attacked by the pawn on b7. The knight on c6 is not only pinned, but now attacked twice and undefended entirely. If rook b8, now simply knight takes c6, forking the queen and rook, threatening a reveal against the king. The rook on b8 is already hit by the bishop on f4. This is a very subtle attack, this move a4. I think a lot of chess players might miss this idea and simply play pawn takes pawn to complete their development, but okay, Alekhine, world champion, did not miss this idea and played a5. Okay, so stopping all of those variations we just looked at, although leaving the bishop on f8 for one more turn is kind of a concession. Okay, here white plays h4, and now h5. h6, it's possible white would probably still play knight takes bishop, but h5 forces white to make a decision about what to do on the king side. Knight takes g6, f takes g6, and now gx h5. If white were to close things up on the king side with g5, then black's knight could reroute via g8 to a more useful square on the chessboard and come back into the game. And these pawns would actually provide some cover to the king side. So while it might be tempting to push, it's not the correct plan. If white were to try to attack this pawn on g6, let's say knight g8, queen d3, then the knight could return to e7 where it's defending that pawn as well, and as long as the queen stays on d3, our knight can stay on e7. Okay, and so that's why Nimzovitsch decided to exchange pawns here. And gx h5, queen e2. Black castles long, and so does white. And this move, 0-0-0, Alekhine in his notes, he gave it an exclamation mark, which is for a very concrete reason. So black still has this idea of playing c takes d4 and completing development with bishop b4. That's what black would like to do. But this bishop on f4 is such a powerful piece around black's king that castling queenside has set up something of a trap for black. If black were to play pawn takes pawn now, e takes d4, and this pawn on d4, it looks like we're attacking it twice and it's only defended once. So if we try to win it with knight takes d4, this pawn is actually poisoned. Rook takes d4 is possible. And after queen takes d4, queen takes e6 check is like a lightning bolt out of a clear blue sky. There's not a lot of great moves here for black, and the obvious move, knight d7, it fails to a checkmate in 2. See if you can find it. It's the pretty queen sacrifice on c6. Queen c6 check, pawn takes queen, bishop a6 is mate. Really nice double bishop mate. I think this double bishop mate pattern occurs most often when the king is castled on the queen side. I've seen a few examples. Okay, that's not what happened in the game though. Alekhine saw the danger of the bishop on f4 and played bishop d6 to exchange off that bishop and hold these dark squares around his king. Bx d6, rx d6, and now bishop d3. A voluntary retreat of the bishop. This is a move that Alekhine disparaged in his notes to the game. He gave it a question mark. And we'll see in the game, this bishop becomes a problem piece for white. It never finds a useful job. Given how the game goes, it might almost have been better to simply exchange it off for the knight. Nimzovitch's idea, as we see here by this arrow, is to vacate this square to put the knight there. Which is a nice idea, except for the fact that this bishop it really gets into trouble. Immediately, c4 is sort of asking the bishop, okay, bishop, where are you going to go? There's not many options. There's really only one, g6, and so bishop g6 is played. If white tried to play the move knight b5 here, which has some logic to it, the idea of course, is if pawn takes bishop, we have knight takes rook check. It doesn't quite work, because after king d7, queen takes d3, king takes d6, we reach a position where black has two minor pieces for the rook. So it just doesn't pan out, this variation, knight b5. So bishop g6 is white's only move here. Okay, knight e7, attacking the bishop, which has more or less run out of squares, and forcing it to be defended. Rook g1. I suppose f7 was possible. We'll see that later in the game. And now black comes up with a nice rearrangement of pieces to apply pressure to white's castled king. Beginning with queen b4. The idea is to bring the rook on d6 over to b6, to put pressure on white's castled king. Also, on the third rank, this rook, it could potentially be harassing the bishop still as well. Okay, king d2, and now rook b6, attacking this b2 pawn. Here white plays the move f3, which is a very deep and interesting move. White has to control this e4 square to prevent a knight from landing there. Let's look at why. So this move, rook b6, sets up another queen sacrifice trap that Nimzovitsch saw and avoided with the move f3. But if he had played, for instance, bishop f7, now black could play queen takes b2 without fear of trapping the queen. Rook b1 appears to attack the queen and leave it with nowhere meaningful to go. If queen a3, then rook takes rook looks pretty good for white. However, here there's a checkmate pattern, starting with the queen sacrifice, queen takes c3. If the king takes the unprotected queen, knight e4 is a very pretty checkmate. The knight attacks these two squares, the rook controls the b file, the pawn plays a part. If after queen takes knight check, if the king retreats, well, here rook takes rook is possible. Queen a3 first, pushing the king back to d2, would allow this knight to come into the game, and we have a mating attack again. It's not mate yet, but it will be soon. Okay. That did not occur in the game, though, but it's an interesting sideline. And it explains why after rook b6, Nimzovitsch felt obligated to play f3. A lot of tactics on this e4 square now won't be possible. Here, rook h6. It attacks the bishop and leaves it with not very many options. The only one is f7. And now f5, knight f5, brings the knight to the center. Queen h2. Nimzovitsch now gets a little desperate and starts to try to save the game by getting counterplay against black's king, by bringing the queen into the encampment of black's king along his diagonal. Queen e7, attacking the bishop and leaving it with nowhere to go. For instance, here, if the bishop were to retreat to g6, where it appears to be defended by the rook on g1. Black actually has a tactic to attack it again, and that is knight takes h4. And the bishop has no safe escape squares. If the queen were to take the knight, well, now we can ignore the bishop and actually focus on the queen. Our queen on e7 is pointed directly at the queen on h4. So knight e4 would be a check, revealing our queen against the other queen. Okay. So after this move, queen e7, white does not bother playing bishop g6, and instead plays the move knight b5. Putting the knight on this fantastic outpost and hoping that some counterplay against black's king will make up for the lost material. Queen takes bishop, and now knight a7 check, king d7. This move allows the queen, well, he didn't have much of an option, into black's camp. However, black has plenty of ways to hold the position together, and knight d6 is a very straightforward move, holding this pawn a second time, also holding this square so that queen c8 is not a check. Rook g5 is played, and now knight f e8, bringing another piece back to defend. The knight on e8 not only holds the square c7, but also this anchor pawn on g7, which is important because this is the open file that white is hoping to double rooks and attack along. Rook dg1, and now rook f6. And black is eyeing this f3 pawn. You might think, okay, well, on the previous turn, black could have captured on f3 with the queen. The knight is defending g7, so rook takes g7 is impossible. Black is already up material. But if queen takes f3, this would actually be a mistake. It allows white to sacrifice the exchange here, and after rook takes knight, there's not a lot of places for the black king to run to. The knight is holding the escape square c6, the queen is holding all of these squares, and so the only option for black would be to interpose this knight on f7. But now the little subtlety rook g8 would set up some unpleasant mating ideas for white. This would force black to take a perpetual with queen f2, let's say king d1, queen f3, and okay, the king can move around the chessboard. We'll check the king back and forth, and eventually it will be a perpetual. If queen f2 and the king tries to run away, here there's actually nowhere to go. That would not be the right idea because this move is mate. So white's king would also have to accept their perpetual and simply move back and forth. You might be wondering, okay, what if black tries to bring another piece to the attack with something like, let's say after king e1, rook f6 maybe. Where's the mate? Well, there's a few different mating attacks here, but queen c8 is the fastest. King d6, and now rook d8, check, leaving the king with no safe haven but e7, win either piece to d7 is mate. Okay, so for all of these little sidelines, this is why, rather than capture the pawn on f3, Alekhine took a turn to play rook f6. f4. White now is lost, is completely lost. There's not much left to do. The queen is trapped in the corner, the knight does not have much of a future. The one weak point in black's position is defended very nicely by the queen and the knight. g6, it's now defended by the rook and the queen, and the pawn on g6 also defends what was the other weak point, h5. King c1, queen h7, c3, queen f7, king b1, queen e7, I have to admit, I'm not sure why both sides kept playing. It seems like the position is completely winning for black, but maybe white was hoping for some sort of a blunder from Alekhine. He didn't. He did not get hasty though. He took his time. After queen a2, it's interesting to notice here. It might look like this pawn was now only defended once, but if rook takes, this would actually be a mistake because queen h7 would be skewering or pinning, I guess, pinning the rook to the king, and that would win more material. And so because of that, king a2, it does threaten to win that pawn. Rook f8, however, focuses black's energy on corralling the queen. Knight b5, an exchange of knights, followed by the move knight c7, and the queen has run out of squares. She goes to a7, and after queen b6, white resigned. For instance, one continuation may be rook takes g6, knight takes, and the queen now can't come to the back rank, it can't take on b7, all these squares are attacked by rooks, and if queen takes pawn, rook a6 pins the queen to the king, and after pawn takes, this should be pretty easy to win for the world champion. Okay, I thought that was a really beautiful game. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. If you like these videos, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. I'm going to try to do one of these a day. I'd like to go through every major game by Alexander Alekhine. Maybe you can join me on this journey.